I recently had a pure pleasure of interviewing Bram Adams, a community ambassador for OpenAI and a hacker known for his creative and fun developer experiments. I first time came across Bram when I was researching GPT-3 demos, and I quickly fell in love with his demo of teaching GPT-3 based bots to generate Instagram-worthy poetry. Another very cool thing I remember from looking at his works was a conversation with his artificial self using GPT-3 and AR-Kit. Bram has done many more exciting experiments with AI, AR, VR, different types of APIs, and recently he focused his creative energy on Codex. This is where I got to talk to him directly about his work. I hope you enjoy our interview.
Thanks so much, Ram, for finding the time to talk to me today. I'm very excited to dive a little bit deeper into Codex with you because I know you're definitely have been exploring it in depth. From what I could see, actually, that's part of one of the first questions I have today, generally for you, of the very interesting experiments that I have seen of yourself with Codex was trying to use it in the contactless type of context. So, just trying to move the screen without the use of without the interaction with the hardware and just using your hands and the camera or speaking to it. So voice command.
Make a header. Make it bigger.
Super cool, first of all, very futuristic looking. And I was curious kind of what brought your attention into this particular area to start playing with Codex.
Yeah, well, I mean, first, thank you for having me. When you introduced me, I didn't want to cut out the Discord thing, but I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for also taking the time. For those particular projects, I guess the thing that I was thinking about was why have we been limited to keyboard and mice as the main medium of interacting with computers for so long? I think keyboard and mice make a lot of sense ergonomically. I think they make a lot of sense um, because that's where our hands generally sit anyway, and we kind of like have motion, but it leads to, a lot of people having issues with like repetitive strain injuries and stuff like that, especially in the field of software engineering. And I was really inspired by a tool called Serenade, which is another AI company that actually does voice decoding. And I was like, oh, Codex actually seems also like an amazing use case for this type of technology to really kind of like take another shot on goal of how can we expand the way that there's now the technology is starting to catch up. So about, maybe 20 years ago, keyboards and mice were the primary mode of operation because it was the easiest way of sending messages back to the CPU and the message bus so that it could like dictate kind of things to the computer. But thanks to advances in deep learning, we know a lot more about the human voice. We know a lot more about tracking hands against the background. We know a lot more about tracking eye gestures and things like that as well. So I think it's a really good time to be in the space and say, okay, cool, we have all these new AI tools. How can we use them to play with computers in different ways?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, again, amazing direction. I'd love to see more, more mature projects coming soon within the space because I think Codex has immense capabilities when it comes to especially voice command. What would you say was like the most exciting thing when you were playing with it? Was there any like aha moments that you discovered once? Because also like, to give guys a little bit more context, you're the community ambassador of OpenAI, and you got a chance to check out Codex and its different use cases a little bit ahead. So you were one of the first people putting the feet on the moon, I guess. We can call it that way. So yeah, like what were your most exciting discoveries so far with it?
I think the big thing for me, as someone who writes code in a day-to-day type of experience, is that a lot of people are kind of limited by the apps that they use. And I don't mean limited in a bad way. I think there's a lot of amazing apps like Ableton, for example, Final Cut Pro for video editing, Logic, all these really specific tools, Photoshop, that have very specific purposes. But then under the hood is code, right? So it's like even though it seems like Photoshop is its own application that isn't written out of code, it is, right? It's just doing image manipulation in the background and saving images to a file database and retrieving them and layering them on top of each other. Um, and I think that Codex, the big aha moment for me was doing video editing with Codex a little bit by using a library called MoviePy. And I was like, it was a very natural language kind of process where I was like, I want the first 10 seconds of this video and the last 10 seconds of this video. And then I want a title that says like my day at the museum, a very simple, obviously very immature type app, but it showed me the flexibility or reminded me the flexibility that coding had and really kind of got excited about getting other people on board with that kind of thing because code itself is it's probably the most powerful tool that I've interacted with in my day-to-day life. And I know that's quite a big claim to make because we interact with so many powerful tools, as simple as Bluetooth headphones to the cars that we drive to the planes that we're in. Like, how can I make the claim that code is the most powerful tool that humans have ever created? And I think the reason that it's so powerful is because of its versatility, because it can't really it builds upon itself and creates new versions of itself by existing. And I haven't found many other tools that fit that bill of being able to, you know, for example, in the 1960s, they were like, okay, let's figure out how to move ones and zeros across a logic board, right? And then that led into like the 70s and 80s where they were like, okay, now that we have all these ones and zeros moving across a logic board, let's get them to show up on a screen, right? And then everybody was like, okay, now that we have a screen, what do we put on the screen? You know what I mean, right? And then they're like, oh,
Yeah.
but what if these screens could talk to each other? And that's where the internet came from, right? And then all these kind of things like build up off of each other, and it creates this extremely powerful, versatile, and exciting environment that I think is always changing and building upon itself. So I think that Codex was a really good example of that, of showing people, hey, you like video editing, you like photo editing, you like making music. Those things might not seem directly related to coding, but as long as you can have some kind of relationship with the computer in that thing that you're doing,
Mhm.
or technology, then Codex can help you, code it can help you, and Codex writes code.
That's amazing. You have very, very creative way of looking at code. I really love it. I think it's unique in many ways. I've never heard anybody looking at it so kind of broadly. I know many people working with code like consider it one the most powerful tool in their work, but probably not thinking about it so broadly. Um, I am curious if during these experiments, uh, were there any moments where you found some unanswered questions for yourself? Were there any like do you still kind of struggle with Codex in any way? Is there anything puzzling for you with it?
I think the biggest unanswered question with tools like GPT-3 and Codex in general is unmet expectations. I think that a lot of the
Mm.
time people will be very pleased by their first couple interactions with these natural language models, and then they'll be upset that they can't replicate these results at a consistent kind of level. And I think that's kind of part of the fun for me and people who like to play around with these tools is to really try and get the system to be consistent in the way that we expect it to be. And I think that, you know, I was never really good at the traditional form of artificial intelligence in terms of training matrices and stuff like that. Uh, in terms of just like optimization problems, where it's like, okay, here's k-means and all these different algorithms that we use to kind of like do clustering and stuff like that. But when I played with GPT-3 for the first time, and then by extension Codex, because they operate very similarly, I felt I could truly become the best at this. You know what I mean, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
felt like it thinks the way that I think, and that was a huge boon for me because I was like, okay, here's a tool that can basically I can outsource my thinking to, and I can optimize the AI through conversation. So it's more about persuasion than it is about mathematics with GPT-3 and Codex. And the thing that people are discovering with Codex is, okay, should I write a comment and then that will write all my code for me? Should I write the start of a function and just let it finish the function? Should I write from a high level or a low level? And all these questions are being answered. But I think the overarching question is how can we managing our expectations while also being curious enough to find new avenues to make these models perform better than they are today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with you that it's like part of the process, and just we're in this crazy moment in history where the barrier becomes so low when it comes to interaction with AI that there is many questions that will continue to be unanswered probably for a long while, but it's at the same time opportunity for people to figure out their ways, their like best practices, processes of doing things, and I think in a sense, OpenAI is as well doing that while looking at how others are interacting with models like Codex or GPT-3. So it's a very exciting place to be, definitely right now. We've touched upon GPT-3 a little bit already, and I think generally speaking, I don't think it was covered so well by OpenAI in terms of what are the exact differences between Codex and GPT-3. Um, would you like to, share your thoughts on that, perhaps?
For sure. I think to the extent of my knowledge, the main difference between Codex and GPT-3 is that, well, Codex was trained on much more code, right? But that's kind of a arbitrary claim. What does it mean to have much more code versus like kind of prose? I think that the way that it was trained is a little bit more interesting in terms of like what's the difference between good code and bad code? You know what I mean? Where is code too repetitive? Where is code written in a very creative fashion? We saw this with the announcement. A lot of people immediately jumped into like saying, "Oh, hey, this is stealing open source. You can't do this, etc., etc." But at the same time, other people were like, "Well, when code is posted on the internet, it's kind of posted on the internet, and anybody can technically copy and paste it and download it into their thing too." So some people, I think, were kind of having trouble delineating between when a human copies something and when a machine copies something. But I think broadly with GPT-3 and Codex, GPT-3 is much more apt to write natural language than Codex is. And I think that that's very apparent when you try to get Codex to write natural language and when you try to get GPT-3 to write code. They both feel kind of like off for some reason, right? Like this GPT-3 will add a lot of randomness to the code where there probably shouldn't be, unless it's a very simple answer. And Codex, vice versa, when it's trying to write natural language, just isn't creative at all, right? So if you need a more creative natural language type of solution, GPT-3 is definitely your best bet because human language is a lot more abstract than code, in the sense that there is no there are structures within human speech. We speak in a very particular manner. So I wouldn't say a verb after a noun, for example. You know what I mean? Like dog went store go doesn't really make sense. The dog went to the store makes more sense, right? So there are
Mhm.
structures within natural language, but they're not nearly as strict as they are in code, and they're not nearly as prevalent in a way that the model would need to be cognizant of the fact that it's trained against writing something that's really strict. So because the model of Codex is trained to write code, it needs to have a really good understanding that every bracket needs to be in the right place, and you need to have parentheses that match up, and you need to have semicolons.
Hmm. And do you perhaps know at the level of engineering the model, was it a matter of increasing the sample of code only, or was it, or like, was there more to it? Was it just like throwing a lot more GitHub into Codex and arriving at Codex, or how did that, how did they achieve that?
Well, for what I can say, some parts I can't. I don't think, but I think yes, yes, it was trained on much more code for sure,
Mhm.
frequency wise, quantity wise, but it was also trained again on I think the idea uh, of using kind of like a reinforcement learning technique of is this correct code versus is this not correct code? Is this code runnable?
Mm,
You know what I mean? I think that that's a big
mm,
kind of codex question that is open-ended, is getting it to write runnable code and completely, in an environment, if I just copy pasted the result that Codex gave me into JS Fiddle or something like that, would it be able to run without any extra imports or dependencies and stuff like that? Versus GPT-3, which never had to worry about that kind of thing. It was like, let me just write a poem about, you know, how much I hate Mondays, And I could be completely wrong about this again from interacting with Codex and playing with it for a lot of time now. I can tell that it's very focused as a technology on writing correct code.
mhm. Okay, awesome. So now I have a question about your opinion about all the different types of demos and projects that have evolved from releasing codecs to broader and broader number of users. Was there anything that struck you particularly as like a really good project that you think has a great chance of, helping others to do whatever they're doing better?
Well, I mean, I could answer this question in a few ways. I think that GitHub Copilot, obviously, when I got access to GitHub Copilot and I've been playing around with it as somebody who writes code on a day-to-day basis, has been a complete game changer. And I can't believe I didn't have a tool like this uh, in the years that I've been coding. It just saves so much time and mental effort to go and find something when you can just like have it in your editor, and it kind of feels like the next evolution of what editors are kind of trying to lean into, of like saying, okay, what if the code wrote itself, and it was kind of like more of a dance than a software engineer. And of course I'm saying this as somebody who's been coding for a decade, so I'm really comfortable with code in general. So I feel like maybe someone who's new to code would end up crushing on a tool like Copilot and not actually learn the stuff that I learned. But then that could just be me being an old fogey who can break it into small steps for Codex to kind of like chunk through. Um, and I think that it will make video editors' lives a lot easier, right? So instead of having, like, one of the things that, just to slightly tangent this conversation, I also do is like make music. I do like music production stuff. Not as much these days, but I used to a lot a few years ago. And when I discovered Sonic Pi and title cycles, I was like, oh, cool, now I can code music. And it felt very different, not because, again, necessarily that it was more different than when I was clicking in notes in Ableton and then adding a mixer and stuff like that. But because I was typing that out, I ended up being able to copy paste, which is super powerful, and being able to change one variable and have it change the whole feeling of the song. And I think that's the similar thing with video editing, where people are going to be able to take advantage of the flexibility that code provides of, oh, I don't want to go back and re-edit this whole video, but if I can just change this one line of code, it'll remake the whole video for me and I don't need to think about it, right? So there's a bunch of tools that we software engineers take advantage of in our day-to-day lives, like Git and CI/CD and all these different kind of tools that like manage computers and our relationship with computers and makes that relationship so much easier, that really just hasn't propagated to other fields. Like people who edit photos for a living, like web for a living, are really just stuck until Adobe makes a new Photoshop, right? Or
Mm,
people who want to make music are like, okay, do I do Ableton or FL Studio? And that's pretty much my only options. Like, of course, I could play the drums and record it with a tape recorder and then go over to the machine and type in all the, you know what I mean? But that would take forever. So, like, I think that the idea is to give more people, get more people closer to the code, and being able to do it themselves, without needing to wait for these big companies to come through and say, we made an update to Gmail, so now you can do your job again, or Slack, you know?
Hmm. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's like whenever there is some advancements or experiments in terms of AI and movie industry, for example, I'm really super excited about. I think that there has been already released movies that were completely edited by AI, because like editing is a huge part of creating the narrative in the movie once you have the material, and it's a lot of hard work, and it's also very kind of nitty-gritty things that you would like to automate, perhaps. So if we had more help in that aspect, that would be fabulous. So how about yourself? Do you have any type of projects you're working on or would like to work on with Codex or with GPT-3, perhaps?
Yeah, so I actually do have a Codex product in production, called Stenography. It's definitely taken up the past 6 months of my life now. I guess we're in October. So yeah, I started working on it, I think, in earnest in late March, early April. Stenography's main problem solve was basically when I was walking around, I spent a lot of time, as you know, you found me through my demo work kind of on Twitter before I deleted my Twitter. And I love to make creative tech demos, but then one of the things that I also found was that I needed to market and distribute them. I needed to write a blog post about it. I need to make a YouTube video about it. And that itself is its own vertical of work. And I really didn't like doing all that work. So I was like, oh, it'd be really great if something could just explain this code for me. So I didn't really need to go do it. I could just focus on writing code, which is the thing I like to do. I like to turn on music and write code. Uh, and I was like, you know what? I think I can get GPT-3 to do that for me. So I started playing around with the different models and asking different kind of questions of getting it to explain code and explain variables and, have like these different kind of relationships with code. And it's really evolved into something that I couldn't have even predicted, where stenography is a much more fully fleshed out idea of that, of saying like, what is this code doing? What kind of context can we extract from the code, as in like what programming languages are written in? Can the AI correctly guess that? Can it also predict good Stack Overflow questions to use? Can it populate it with relevant documentation so you wouldn't need to go Google that? Can you ask questions against that code? What would auto documentation look like? You know what I mean? So there's all these kind of questions that I think have been opened up by stenography, and there was a lot of non-AI questions as well that I learned a ton about. I think that we live very broadly in an API economy. Not to again take this conversation in a different direction, but I think that it's important, and I think that they're intrinsically linked. Um, where OpenAI provides this super powerful API, but there's also a ton of other super powerful APIs out there for people to get their hands on. Auth0 for authentication, Stripe for getting payments into your application. Cloudflare Workers are basically these edge distributed serverless functions that are super cheap and run super fast, and that allows people, any person, to just have an idea with code and then just put it on a Cloudflare worker, and then it gets globally distributed to the whole world immediately. And that is just insanely powerful. And when you can kind of combine all these tools and you can mix and match, it really, I think, leads to building these full-bodied kind of apps. So I think my big learning with stenography was that even if the product goes to zero, which I don't think it will, I think it's a very exciting space, and the product is still developing in the sense that like the AI is getting better, so it's getting more correct at its explanations. I'm thinking of really cool new ways of showing these explanations in terms of like visual graphs and all these like search features and stuff like that as well. Um, but more importantly, uh, it's really again showed me the power of taking these different tools and being able to combine them into a full production application that can help people, and then the creator also benefits, right? So it seems that like with a lot of these tools, it was always one way or another, where it's like the company benefits or like consumer benefits, right? The producer, the consumer benefits, and it was really hard to kind of strike up a mutual beneficiary agreement. For example, with something like Google, it's free for everybody to use. I'm sure we all use Google thousands of times a day, but Google doesn't ever charge us a cent because they make all their money from advertisers. But that kind of causes new startups to have to feel awkward about asking people to pay for things directly because the most powerful app on the planet, Google, is free. And that kind of puts them in an awkward position because they're like, well, if Google is free, why would I pay for this thing that's way worse than Google? You know what I mean? But at the same time, it's a completely different business model. And Google is making hand over foot cash because they already have the entire network effect of everybody using Google all the time. So they can just deliver ads like crazy. Um, and in that kind of like benefits them, even though the consumer thinks that they're being benefited, but then it also has a freezing effect against new producers entering the space. So I think that with these new tools like GPT-3 and Codex, in addition to things like Cloudflare Workers and Stripe, Algolia, Twilio, all these APIs, and these are just examples. I think that they all have parent questions of how do we search an app? Where do we store our data? How do we authenticate users? How do we deliver functions across the web? There's a lot of different competitors that you can use in these spaces. These are just the ones that I'm familiar with, and I'm sure there will be better ones in the future that have different use cases. So I'm not at all saying that like Stripe is the end all be all or Auth0 is the end all be all. But I do think that there's a nice competitive kind of thing going there too in terms of like, oh, how do we make the best search problem? How do we make the best texting problem thing easy? Texting API. And that's what I'm trying to do with Stenography. I'm trying to make the easiest API for developers to use to interact with code in a much more fun and healthy manner, where they can just pass in some code and learn something new about it without having to study it themselves. Whether that's let me go find the Stack Overflow questions, whether that's let me find the relevant documentation in my database that is correlated with this code, whether it's just something as simple as what is this code doing, what is it returning, I don't want to read all over it. Can you just tell me? You know what I mean, right? Why can't machines tell us that stuff? So that was my big, that is my big goal with Stenography. And this has been a very long answer, so I'm going to stop talking. But that's kind of what I'm working on.
Yeah, but that's an amazing project. And how do we get started with Stenography? Are you planning to launch? Did you mention early next year, or
Oh no, it's already
what's
launched.
our time? It's
Yeah,
already launched. Okay, so
yeah.
we can sign up via the website and look around.
Yeah, so my strategy with Stenography was, I think, personally kind of interesting because it's a solo founded project, right? It's just me working on it. And I think that, you know, uh, uh, when I first started working on the API, I started working on the extensions first. So I worked on a Visual Studio Code extension, I worked on a Chrome extension, I made a Slack bot, but the API was kind of middling. You know what I mean? Like it was good at what it did for the most part, but then there was very big holes in its logic and stuff like that too. So I actually stepped back and am now just focused on just writing the API, which is to the chagrin of some people who come in and are like, oh, I would really just love a UI tool that I could interact with. And I'm like, yeah, 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 but people could build that off of the API, right? So
Hmm.
my focus right now is just completely API centric. I have a few more creative ideas for applications that can be built off of Stenography that I'm probably going to want to take my hand at. But I think that that's the idea of like these companies like Twilio and Algolia and Auth0 and Cloudflare Workers again, is that like I just want to build something that other people are excited to build off of. And I've built so many fun things with Stenography so far. I also have a investor who was able to build his own um, uh, SQL automatic description app using the Stenography API. So he was
Nice.
able to have it like generate full SQL documentation for data analysts and stuff like that. So there's a lot of different ways that this kind of technology can be used. So I think that that was my big learning is that it is public. People who go to stenography.dev/dashboard can sign up, and then the dashboard has a place where you can call the API directly in there. and then you can just curl it. It's just a regular API similar to the OpenAI API, where it's like you could play around with it in the playground, but the playground's only going to get you so far. If you really want to create the stuff that myself and the other ambassadors have created, if you really want to make a company that's going to move the needle, I always tell people like if they have an API, use the API. You know what I mean? Ignore the rest of it because the
Right.
API is what gives you the flexibility. The API gives you the automation. The API gives you the freedom to say, I wish that it looked like this and functioned like this.
Awesome. Awesome. I'm going to check it out. That's very exciting. Thanks so much for sharing that. And we will link it in the hackathon community so you can guys also check the stenography out. Um, so finally, I have some question around you are very experienced with experimenting and talking publicly about your experiments with different things. And you do it in a very exciting way that makes people like me, for example, follow you and always be curious about what next is going to happen with you just playing around with different algorithms, APIs, and so forth. Is there any like good word of advice that you could share with somebody that's just starting from scratch and is, I don't know, a little bit anxious about tweeting about stuff or just sharing it with the world? Like, what would you advise to somebody that's having an exciting project going on, but not necessarily knows how to, spread the word out there?
I love this question on so many levels because it really has informed my personality for the past 3 to 5 years now. I actually gave a whole talk on it called The Artist
Right.
Practitioner, where I dove into my mental psychology, and a lot of that comes from a very deep, reflective kind of trying to be truthful with myself. You know what I mean? I try not to lie to myself because if I lie to myself, I'm lying to other people. And I think lying to other people is a thing that we do naturally. But if we lie to ourselves too, then it's like it adds an extra layer, right? So I think that there's so many people who are comfortable in lying to themselves because that's just kind of less painful in the immediate term than becoming the person that you want to be and failing. So I think that when it comes to being a hacker, when it comes to creating these kind of edge experiments and stuff like that, I really just chase what feels like a curiosity to me, and then I try to approximate as much as possible without asking other people to help me, right? And that has taught me so much because what ends up happening is that I've realized that I have more knowledge than I thought I did, and that a lot of things um, that I thought were distinct are much more linked, right? So what that means is that like, oh, I didn't know that my knowledge here from playing around with Blender would actually be useful in ARKit, but here it is, you know what I mean? Or something even further than that, like, oh, I didn't know that knowing, about like triads and music would be helpful for, the rule of threes and photography and stuff like that, right? So there's all these different kind of links in human knowledge that we don't really um, appreciate because a lot of human knowledge by experts is siloed. I'm kind of anti-social media at this time in human history. I think sharing in public is something that is a very powerful thing to do, but I think that I have been able to find a much more powerful tool and environment in the uh, using Obsidian, which is a tool that is like a Zettelkasten is what they call it, or Digital Garden. Roam Research is another similar competitor, but they also have a really easy sharing function. So I think sharing your insights on the web for people to find is super useful, but there's also a lot of there's a lot of social pressure to make stuff that gets a lot of likes. The equivalent of someone saying like this video got 500 likes and this video got 500 likes, but this person spent 50 hours making it and this person spent 20 seconds filming a TikTok dance of them doing this. So like I think that it's important to kind of quantify what an individual's goals are if they were doing it for free and nobody cared, right? So like a lot of the projects that I've done, specifically the more popular ones like the self-interview thing with the AR guy and my Skyrim GPT app and the VR world thing and the AR wrapper. Those were just because I was curious. You know what I mean? Like if zero people saw that video, I still would have been happy that I made it. And I think that a good signal for that is if you put it into a portfolio that, is either on your hard drive or hopefully on the internet that other people can see it too. Um, if you come back to it a year later and it makes you smile, then you did a good job. You know what I mean? So I think that I really try to encourage people who are curious about saying, well, the thing that you're doing there is pretty cool. Like, how do you make all these kind of projects and all this stuff? I just tell them, you know, find what you're curious about, don't judge it, and then try to create it. And that's pretty much the root of all of it, right? So if you're curious about a problem, don't judge that problem. Don't judge what it's going to look like in your head. Don't have like a finalized, if it doesn't look like this and have a million users by March, then it's a failure. Um, and then just approximate to the best of your abilities. I'm really not a good artist. I have had an interview before where somebody, it was with the new school, they asked me, they were like, hey, a lot of your work seems to have like a heavy reliance on cubes and stuff like that, and like AR and Blender. Why do you do that? And I was like, because I don't know how to make anything better than cubes. You know what I mean? Like, that's literally the answer, is that I just don't know how to make these beautiful 3D models that other people do. And I'm sure that I could learn, but that's not the thing that I was curious about. I wasn't really curious about lighting and shading. I wasn't really curious about how do I, get these models to look a certain way. I'm curious about the things that I'm curious about, which are making AR interviews and doing all of this silly stuff. So I think that that's my answer, is I just tell people to have a curiosity, don't judge that curiosity, and then try to approximate it to the best of your abilities, addendum in a time frame that's achievable, right? So sometimes I think another thing that people will do is they'll just cycle on different half-built projects for 6 months. So just giving yourself a week and saying, how far can I take this in a week? You'll be so surprised with, the first project totally crappy, but by the time that you're at project 10, 12, you're going to be very impressed with what you can do in a week.
I love your answer so much. Like I see so much of my own sort of journey with even video creating. It's like story creating in what you're mentioning. So thank you a lot for that and for your insight. All right. I guess I took much more of your time than I promised, so I'm gonna wrap up here. Thank you so much for sitting down with me. I always enjoy talking to you so much, and I always feel like I learn things on in like in so many like you have multi-dimensional perspective for sure, and I love that about you and your insights. So yeah, thanks a lot once again, and let's keep in touch. I'm gonna keep an eye, and I hope everybody here will keep an eye on your future work, and we will check stenography of course right afterwards.
Thank you so much for your time and the amazing questions. And yeah, please do reach out to me. Like I said, I don't have social media anymore, but if anybody is interested, curious to reach out to me, you can email me or find me through. I have some secret tunnels in my Zettelkasten, and that if people do take the time to dive into, they will find ways to contact me and have things to talk to me about. So I would encourage people who are curious to check it out. But that's a part of the game for me. I'm just a person like that. But thank you so much for your time, Sandra, and thank you for having me, Nextgrid. I really appreciate it.